Welcome back to the boss mode walkthrough series. This is the second half of chapter 8, Goblin Walker's normal mode. We can see from the enemies that we're dealing with a bunch of blues. Anytime I see a dungeon full of blue enemies, my first instinct is to always grab my Goblin team and bring along Hansuke for the extra defense buff. Having only run this once or twice before with Undead, I've not really taken stock of the actual buffs and stuff on the actual enemies. Really, from what you've seen so far with me running my Goblin team, it seems to be there's always a reason not to run them. So anytime I really get a chance to do so, I like to do that because the dungeons tend to go fast. What I'm ultimately looking for when running against a blue team or even just running with my Goblin team in general, scout out their buffs, take a look at what we're dealing with here in terms of what sort of traits they have. Ultimately, what I'm looking for is that we're not dealing with something like with the boss mode King Kong or some of the other hardcore blue guys that are immune to criticals. We want to make sure that we're doing criticals with our Goblin team because that's the whole logic behind them. So there are a couple of things that could be bad here. These guys have extra damage towards warrior, so you do have to watch out for that. They do have the challenge accepted. I don't plan on taunting with Bramble, so that shouldn't be an issue. They also have what's called a purge touch. You'll see that with some of these guys. When they hit you, they may remove your Goblin dance party. So it's good to have your Goblins already runed to be 50% critical. I know some people rune their Goblins a little bit more towards attack and power, but I tend to focus more so on the critical than anything. My Goblin team is by no means a legendary Goblin team compared to like my Undead team. So if you have even a reasonable Goblin team and one other person, I think you should be able to handle this one fairly easily. My Goblin team right now is mostly stacked up with improved runes. The only reason I have not swapped those out yet is because some of the improved runes that I have upwards of like 8, 9, or 10% total critical on them. And I just didn't have the greater runes that had that sort of skill or critical chance on there that I just never got around to swapping out. And since the Goblin team has not been a main staple for the boss mode, more so like it was with the Champion campaign, boss mode has been more so just about the Undead team. So I hadn't had a real pressing need to upgrade those runes yet on these guys and really worry about min-maxing right now. In the long run, I'll probably take a few minutes to slowly swap those out. But for what we're dealing with now, they're usually pretty decent. Usually when I use Goblin team, it's just a matter of getting the first couple of criticals in there and rolling with it at that point. I run my Goblin team for Savage Grove when farming totems, and since it can get through that pretty much on auto run, I haven't had a real need to worry about those runes yet. So that's still further down the line. We'll see where the latter half of the boss mode campaign takes us and what sort of synergies are available for the Goblin team if they happen to change those, or even if they just make them a little bit more viable. If they're going to keep throwing out those enemies that have immune to crit, then obviously they're not going to be as viable in the boss mode. So when running this dungeon here, like I said, you can use a couple of different teams. I just kind of defaulted to the Goblin team. You can see that when they use that purge touch, they are kind of making things a little bit more of a nuisance because they do remove my boost to the critical, and it's not just that, it's the boost to the attack as well anytime Goblin Dance Party gets removed. And we saw Zerk was taking a little bit of damage there as well. The main thing is we don't want Nub Nub losing his critical because he's obviously the reason the team stays alive. Is anytime he crits, he's gonna top off the team. So hopefully most of the guys don't attack him, so they don't remove his buffs. But you should be prepared to use your heals, and also just remember that because they are going to debuff you when they attack you. It's possible you're going to lose a couple of turns of healing too, so be mindful of how you actually anticipate using that heal. And if you're expecting a heal over time, you do need to be a little bit cautious. For the most part, though, the dungeon itself isn't too much of a challenge, in my opinion. Um, so you can kind of experiment around with the actual teams here. Um, since we're kind of in a lull right now as far as the playthrough. If anybody wants to see a different team attempted here, something like the undead team or just some other atypical team that's not the goblin team, if you want to see something else, um, feel free to post that in the comments and I'll gladly switch things up. Between the champion mode and the boss mode, you'll see some different teams as it is already, so not too much of an issue here. So the big thing to note about this boss fight compared to other boss fights is there's a ton of guys out there. And I know even if you have a really good undead team, I don't like seeing guys. Even though we have a really good or solid goblin team, you don't want to see a lot of guys because it's unlikely that you'd be able to do enough damage to kill all of them. So ultimately, when I'm looking at these buffs here, again, I'm looking for a couple of main things. I'm looking to make sure they're not immune to critical. I happen to scout out that they have the Vendetta trait. Anybody that's used to running Permafrost Ice Cavern to farm totems knows that the Vendetta is kind of a nuisance, especially when running Goblin teams, because if every attack is going to be a critical and it's going to get a revenge attack, you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of how much actual attacking you want to do. So in the long run, would you want to run a Goblin team against this dungeon? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on what you plan on doing when you get here. My goal is to use Friends Heroes like I just did here and just kind of clean up some trash. I figured that after that, as long as there's not a bunch of guys attacking me, I could probably survive long enough, and even if I had to use a revive potion. So like I said, even with the bonus to the crit, that's not the only thing that we like to see with that Goblin Dance Party. It does boost the attack. Once that happens, then they do a lot more damage. Keep in mind, these guys also dish out the boss Frostbite, which is not pretty. So if you're going to use an undead team, you probably don't have to worry about too much. But if you're using skills, be cautious about that. So other than that, pretty easy run. I said if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, stop back again for champion mode, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.